Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, everybody. And this is, of course, Native Plant Month in the Rio Grande Valley. A wonderful way to celebrate it. I want to talk to you today about my idea of homegrown national park as a way of building biological networks that are going to connect all kinds of habitats that we create right in our yards and go a long way towards saving biodiversity on planet Earth. Before we do that, let me ask you if you know what this is. It looks like a fecal dropping. You know that birds in a nest, they don't want their babies to poop in the nest, so they pick up a fecal sac when the birds are ready to poop, and they fly it out from the nest and they just drop it. And that's what this looks like. But it's actually a spider. If you zoom in there, you see the legs here, pretending to be a bird fecal sac, because nothing wants to eat a fecal sac. It's the bola spider, and at night it really does look like a spider. It hangs from a leaf and it drops a single strand of silk, and then it goes hunting. You wouldn't think it would catch anything with a single strand of silk, but it does. Moths fly in and get caught, and the first thing it does is spin them around and wrap them up very tightly. Then it has a nice meal. Then it goes hunting again, and it catches another one, and it catches another one. And after it's caught enough moths, it will spin an egg sac. It's all out of silk, and the eggs are in the middle there, and that's how it spends the winter. And if there's enough moths around, it'll go hunting again and try to make another egg sac. Why are those moths flying into this strand of silk here? It's not an accident. This bola spider is actually releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. So if she's pretending to be a female of that moth species, the males fly in and get caught. And I was interested in what the species was that she was catching in my yard, and it turned out to be a bronze cutworm. I unwound all those little bodies and found out what it was. And I've got bronze cutworm adults because I've got bronze cutworm larvae, and I've got bronze cutworm larvae because I've got goldenrod. That's their primary host plant. I also have this beautiful moth, the dot line white, because I've got oak trees, primarily white oak trees, and because I don't rake the leaves away. There is a dot line white cocoon in this leaf litter, and you're not going to see it when you go to rake leaves. There it is, right there. If we zoom in, it's very difficult to see, but it's one of the reasons that we want to keep the leaves that fall on our property, because they contain the next generation of the moths that are a primary food source for birds the following year. I've got evening primrose moths on my property because I planted evening primrose. And the moths come, they spend the day with their heads stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. I also have zebra swallowtails because I planted pawpaw. That is the only host plant that caterpillar eats to become that beautiful butterfly. As a matter of fact, it would take me a long time to describe all of the species that now call our property home. But it wouldn't take me very long to describe what's calling this property home. In a typical suburban landscape, there's very little there. There's no goldenrod, so there's no bronze cutworm, so there's no bola spiders. There's no oak trees, so there's no dot line whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth. There's no pawpaws, so there's no zebra swallowtails. There's very little that can live in a typical suburban landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the U.S. And it's one of the reasons that we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. Talking about global insect decline. And this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is already gone. 1 million species are threatened with extinction, according to the UN. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. Really, really bad news. And that's why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write a book about the 6th great extinction event that the Earth has ever experienced. But this is the first one that's ever been caused by one of the inhabitants of the Earth, and that, of course, is us. So, you know, our reaction to this bad news is noticeable. People are upset, so much so that scientists are actually studying how we're reacting to biodiversity losses. And one of those scientists is Richard Hobbs. He wrote a paper about it. And he said, gee, our reaction to biodiversity loss is very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we find out we have a terminal disease. First, there's denial. And we certainly have a lot of denial out there, denying that we have a problem at all. Anger, I feel that sometimes. Bargaining, oh, what can we do? We got to fix it. Depression, yeah, we got a lot of that too. And then the final stage is acceptance. And this is where I'm going to push back, because acceptance is the same thing as giving up. And giving up is not an option here, folks, because nature is not optional. It's what keeps us alive on this planet. So let's propose a sixth stage, and that is action. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but they weren't designed for conservation. Our parks and preserves were preserved primarily because they were beautiful places. As a matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt did a lot to expand the national park system. And he said the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back, as he should have, and the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in. They were not created with the idea of conserving life around us. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the US in national parks. Only 12% is federally protected, which means 88% is not. And what's happening in that 88% is appalling. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural areas disappears to development. Development's the most oxymoronic word in all of ecology. We got 44 million acres of lawn. That's an area larger than the size of New England. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio, and that statistic is 15 years old, so who knows how much we paved over now. 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined, dedicated to golf. Well, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and people are wondering why they are not large enough to sustain the biodiversity that we need. And that is the answer. They are not large enough. They are too small. There's several reasons why they're not enough, but the size of these parks is the major one. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down into a little habitat fragment, and this is an exaggeration, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Tiny populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Well, because all populations fluctuate. In good times, they go up, and bad times, they go down. If you're a large population, just like this one, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, during those normal fluctuations, you often hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize that patch, you're permanently gone. That's called local extinction. And studies all over the world, and some of them quite long, more than 100 years in length, are telling us the same thing. We have not preserved enough of the natural world to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because remember, it is nature that sustains us. Now, we tend to use extinction as a metric of trouble. I don't like that, because that's like going to the doctor when you're already dead. That's a little late. It's better to look at the decline of what was once abundant species as a signal of big trouble. And we've got a number of those declines that we can look at. This is the American chestnut. Used to be the dominant tree along the crest of the Appalachians from Maine all the way to Georgia. And of course, we brought over the chestnut blight and essentially eliminated it. They're not extinct. Those rootstocks are still there, and they send up little sprouts, but they're functionally extinct. They're no longer performing their role in their ecosystem. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. Used to be one of the most common bumblebees in the entire continent. Now, if you find one, it's a big deal, because they are on the brink of extinction. Again, not gone, but functionally gone. The American beaver. The beaver, before Europeans came and essentially eliminated it, determined the hydrology of the entire country. And when we eliminated it, changed the hydrology of the entire country, not for the better. Now, the beaver's not extinct either, and it's actually coming back in some places. But the hydrology that it once controlled has been changed, and we would need a lot more beavers restored to replace all those functional wetlands. So we're really talking about defaunation as the problem, the reduction in abundance of species that once ran our ecosystems. That's the real problem. It's local, it's everywhere, and surprisingly, we don't even notice it. Why don't we notice it? Because of something called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids is the way they've always been and the way they ought to be. So, of course, if you're born into a world that's already depauperate in terms of the species around you, you think that's normal, so you don't react to it. None of us, for example, miss the passenger pigeon. It used to be the most common bird on the entire planet. but it was extinct before any of us were born, so we don't think about it. So shifting baseline means that we're losing biodiversity. We're losing the biodiversity that sustains us, and we don't even notice. So what are we going to do? Well, the UN has noticed that we've got a biodiversity issue. They had a big meeting last year in Montreal to talk about biodiversity. You know what the UN does? They make resolutions. This was a headline that came out of that meeting. Crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. So we're negotiating whether or not we're going to protect the stuff that keeps us alive on the planet. All right, good, happy negotiations, and I'm looking forward to their resolutions, none of which have ever been followed. So I'm not going to depend on that. E.O. Wilson, a great biologist, entomologist from Harvard. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. He had a lot to say about conservation of biodiversity. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he didn't mince any words. He said, look, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, which sounds like a good idea, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere. That includes humans. That's a very bold statement, and he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement, and then he ended the book. He did not spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are declining can be in that half, and we can all be in the other half. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and I don't see that disappearing. And we've got 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape and railroads and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering how we can actually realize E.O. Wilson's dream. I think we can. I think we can, folks, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. We have got to give up the idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. We've held on to that forever. Humans here, nature someplace else. There is no someplace else anymore. So what I want to argue today is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We have to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we have to practice conservation here, but not only here. We got to practice it here too, where, you know, biodiversity is gone, which means we've got to put it back. We've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. So here's the basic problem. We've taken continuous habitat, viable habitat, and we've broken it up into little habitat fragments, tiny little fragments. They're isolated, and of course, that means the populations are tiny, and when they fluctuate, species just keep draining from these isolated habitat fragments. So the solution that has been proposed is to build biological corridors that connect those isolated habitat fragments so that plants and animals can move back and forth between those fragments. It's a good first step. But I don't think it's enough, because the populations are still tiny. These corridors just allow movement. They're not places where these animals can live, or plants. So I'm going to suggest that we restore all the area in between these islands of habitat. So this is better. This is even better. We want to put the plants back, folks. Now, the lightly colored areas here would be our cities and much of our agriculture, but the places where we live and we work, where we play, we can get an awful lot of plants back in there and actually build viable habitats outside of these parks and preserves. But that means we're going to do conservation on private property, and that means we need a new attitude about property rights. We've had this idea that we're allowed to do whatever we want on our property, and nobody can tell us otherwise. We own a piece of the earth. Well, okay, the problem is, our yards are not like Las Vegas. You know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Some of you might have experienced that notion yourself. But what happens on private property does not stay on private property. And that's the problem. Our properties are all parts of local ecosystems, and whatever we do on those properties affects that ecosystem, which means it impacts the entire ecosystem, everything in it, including all of the people. let's just talk about the impact of deciding you're going to have a big lawn. So the amount of lawn you have is going to determine whether rain infiltrates or whether it leaves a stormwater runoff. It's going to determine whether you're adding nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and insecticides to your local watershed. Those are all pollutants, of course. It's going to determine how much carbon you're adding to the atmosphere every time you mow it with that gas-powered mower. It's also going to determine whether you're supporting pollinators or eliminating the resources that they need. Lawn isn't helping pollinators at all. Whether we use big carbon storing trees on our property is going to determine how much carbon we're pulling out of the atmosphere, locking up in plant tissues. It's also going to determine how much we're storing in the ground. Our plants are pumping carbon into the ground through their root systems every single day. And once the carbon is in the soil, it's very stable. It can stay there thousands of years. And our plant choices that we put on our properties are going to determine whether we're harboring ecological tumors like calorie pear and barberry and burning bush and privet. There's so many of them, bamboo, which of course escape our properties and then become, they ecologically castrate all the ecological function because they're pushing out the native plants that do support ecosystem function. Then finally, our plant choices are going to determine whether we're using the plants that actually produce food that supports the food web so that we have animals there, or whether those plants are hanging on to all of that energy themselves. So in short, how we landscape is going to help determine how much life Earth can sustain. It's going to determine the carrying capacity of planet Earth, and that is an awesome responsibility. And it's an awesome responsibility that homeowners don't know they have. But it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis. There's a lot of us out there, and we have a lot more power than we think we do because we own most of the land. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. Which means if we practice conservation on private property, we can make a huge difference. And it also makes property owners the hope and the future of conservation. That'll work. But again, they don't know it at this point. Let's go back to lawn. Lawn is the low-hanging fruit here. Most of us have it on our properties. Again, more than 44 million acres of lawn nationwide. Why do we have lawn? Well, it's a status symbol. It's been a status symbol for centuries, actually, and because we have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if we reduce the area? Let's say, we'll make the math simple. Let's say we got 20 million acres. And we restore that 20 million acres, or we have 40 million acres and we cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home. And that'll be enough area to create what I'm calling homegrown national park, a new national park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all this park, still less than 20 million acres. So homegrown national park will be the biggest park in the country. Well, I had this idea somewhere around 2007. I read that figure about 40 million acres of lawn, and I started talking about it in my talks. And when I wrote Nature's Best Hope, I included a whole chapter about homegrown national park. But that's all I did. I didn't actually create an entity that we would call homegrown national park until I met a woman, Michelle Alfandari, who had recently retired from a licensing career in Manhattan. She didn't know anything about biodiversity, didn't know anything about nature, didn't know we have a biodiversity crisis. But her neighbor dragged her to one of my talks, and she listened. She said, "You know what? You're not reaching your target audience. You're only talking to the choir, the people who already know this." I said, "Well, it's only the choir that invites me." She said, "Yeah, well, you're not going to succeed unless you reach the non-choir. And that means you need to use social media. You need to do all the modern tools of communication." And I said, "Well, I don't really do that." She said, "Well, I do that. Let's form a nonprofit. We can call it Homegrown National Park." And we did. It's about 2.5 years old now, pushing 3 years old. We call it homegrownnationalpark.org. You can go to the website, and the object is to register your property. Well, you join Homegrown National Park for free. Then you register your property, the location, and the amount of your property you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the area you have in lawn. Maybe you're going to plant a keystone plant. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how little of an area that you impact. Then you record that area on the map, and your little piece of your county will light up. And you get to see who else has joined Homegrown National Park in your county. The object, of course, is to get the message that everybody's the future of conservation. To go viral, we want the entire country to light up. So we want to take, here are our existing national parks. We want to turn that into that. Yeah, not a big ask. We can do that. But what are we really asking? We're asking people to reduce the area of lawn, because lawn does not accomplish any of the important ecological goals that all of our properties have. We're going to replace some of that lawn with the native plants that do accomplish those goals. We want to remove invasive species on our properties. Almost every property has invasive plants. Most people don't know it. But remember, if most of the country is privately owned, we all got rid of our invasive plants, we'd be mostly done. We want to protect, supposing you're protecting a natural area now on your property, you want to continue to do that. There are important ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park. One is a significant increase in biodiversity, and we'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. A measurable reduction in invasive species. Again, if everybody got rid of the invasives on their property, we'd be mostly done. When we replace lawn with any other plant, we are drawing more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Lawn is the worst plant in terms of sequestering carbon. So we're going to help climate change. And we're also going to create viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of that park. There are also important sociological products, national awareness, not just what the problems are, but what the solutions are, and our roles in those solutions. We are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential to everybody, and that means everybody owns responsibility to helping to sustain our natural systems. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we also want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations that are out there, Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, Land Conservancies, we want to get the conservation that they're performing on private property. We want to get that recorded on the map so we can see how well we are doing in terms of overall conservation efforts. How are we doing? Well, again, we're young, but we've got over 34,000 members at this point, and 111,000 acres have been recorded on the map. And these figures are more than a month old, so it increases every single day. There is urgency in enacting the Homegrown National Park solution, though. Remember that 135 million acres in residential landscapes? That's a big job. So we all need to get to work. And in order to do that, there's a few things we all have to understand if we're going to succeed. So here are the 4 things that every single landscape must accomplish ecologically if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with Mother Nature. And again, we have to do that. All landscapes have to support food webs. All landscapes have to sequester carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere and store it. All landscapes belong in a watershed. They are lying in a watershed, and they have to manage that watershed in an ethical way. And all landscapes have to support pollinators. So let's talk about each one of those. Lawn doesn't accomplish any of those, and that's why we're starting by converting as much lawn as possible. We've got to learn how important plant choice is. This is burning bush. It's a serious invasive in much of the Northeast, but there's examples of invasives pretty much everywhere. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. In other words, they're capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. If those plants don't pass that on, you don't have any animals. But they're plants that are really good at passing that on, so they're contributing energy to local food webs. There are plants that don't contribute energy to local food webs, and there's plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. the very best plant across the country in terms of supporting food webs is one of the oaks. We got 91 species of oaks, and in 84% of the counties in which they occur naturally, they are the #1 contributor. Of course, in the Rio Grande Valley, you don't have any natural oaks, but these are some of the top contributors. A couple of species of celtis, of hackberries. You've got Texas ebony, you've got honey mesquite. These would be top contributors in terms of allocating energy to the local food web so that you actually have some animals. A good example of a non-contributor would be ginkgo biloba from Asia. Nice ornamental tree, turns yellow in the fall. That's pretty, but nothing eats a ginkgo. And you can think of lots of non-native plants where nothing's eating them, which means they're not contributing any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would, again, be any of those invasive ornamentals that escape our properties, kick out the native plants. They're not contributing any energy. So they're actually removing energy from that local food web. We also have to start to learn how important insects are, not just any old insect, but caterpillars, in terms of their support of local food webs. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. And that's why keystone plants become so important. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, it turns out that just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So it's just a few of our native plants producing most of the food, which is why you should think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the two by fours that hold that house up. They're the support system. Essential. You can't do without them. You cannot build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. What are the best keystone plants where you live? Well, you go to anywhere in the country. You can go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the best woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. So these are just representative plants that are really good in the Rio Grande Valley. We also have to listen to what E.O. Wilson told us. He was a brilliant man. He knew about conservation, and he also knew that insects were the little things that run the world. And if they disappeared, so will we. And we also have to accept that most of the insects that are running the world, the ones that eat plants, are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. And they can only eat particular plants because they have specialized on them, developing the adaptations necessary to get around the defenses of those plants. And those adaptations take eons to fall into place. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly as an example because we all know about the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterfly, of course, is a host plant specialist on milkweed. It is the only plant that it can develop on. And we know that milkweed's a toxic plant. Don't eat a milkweed because if you eat a lot of it, it will stop your heart. It's got compounds called cardiac glycosides, very effective defenses, and it also has sticky latex sap. Well, the monarch's very good at getting around the cardiac glycosides. And it's also good at blocking the flow of sticky latex sap with a behavioral adaptation. So these specialized physiological and behavioral adaptations allow monarchs to eat a plant that most other insects cannot eat. They don't have the adaptations for it. But in so doing, it locks the monarch into eating milkweed. So if we take milkweeds out of our landscapes, we lose the monarch. And the point I want to emphasize is that the monarch is not an exception. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. If we take away the plants on which they have specialized, we're going to lose them. We have to think about pollinators. Now, we're pretty good at this. The nation has talked about pollinators for several years now. They noticed that honeybees were disappearing, so they got excited about that. But it's also our native bees that are in trouble. And we need pollinators everywhere, not just in agriculture. The media will tell you that we need pollinators because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's really about 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't need pollinators because I don't live next to a farm. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere, because they are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Losing our pollinators is not an option, folks. We also have to appreciate much more than we do the ecological value of fallen leaves. Leaves do so many important things. They fall from our trees. Of course, these leaves contain the nutrients that that tree used that year. And if those nutrients are not returned to the soil so that the tree can take them up again in future years and use them again, then you're losing nutrients from your system. So if you rake your leaves away or burn them or put them out as garbage each year, you're starving your trees. You're also exposing the ground to the excessive heat that we have these days, to soil erosion, to wind erosion, which kills the soil community that is in there. There are more species that live in the soil than above the soil, including the mycorrhizal fungi that transfer nutrients to our plants. So what we need are the detritivores, all the organisms that break down those leaves and return the nutrients to the soil. And they all need high humidity. So that's one of the major functions of leaf litter. Now people say, well, I can't keep the leaves on my property because they'll smother my beautiful plants. No, they won't. No, they won't. Plants are really good at getting through leaf litter here, solid leaf litter here, and the plants come right through. They can't pile it 5 feet thick, but normal layers of leaf litter are something plants have adapted to over millions of years. Who was raking the leaves away before we got here? And the leaf, the ground covers, the plants that are going through these leaf litters don't have to be 2 inches high. This is snake root in my house, so it's a ground cover, but they have no trouble getting through the leaf litter. We have to realize how destructive light pollution is. Light pollution is turning out to be one of the major causes of insect decline, global insect decline, because nocturnal insects are killed at lights in a number of different ways, particularly the moths that create the caterpillars that run our food webs. Fortunately, there is an easy fix to light pollution, and that is either turn the lights off, which is really easy, or replace the bulb with a yellow bulb, because nocturnal insects are not attracted to yellow bulbs. If we were to replace our white bulbs with yellow bulbs overnight, we could save millions of insects. And if we used yellow LEDs, we could save millions of dollars as well. And then, of course, we've got insect foggers. We've got mosquito foggers. That's a booming business around the country. And unfortunately, it's killing all the insects that are out there. These guys say it's okay because what they're fogging is a natural product, and it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. That's the insecticide that evolved in chrysanthemums to kill insects. This is industrial strength pyrethroids, but it's a natural product. That doesn't make it okay. Cyanide is a natural product. Ricin is a natural product. So being natural doesn't make it safe. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And unfortunately, that's not even close to being true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including those poor monarchs that we're trying to save, which are now red listed by the IUCN, by the way. We've lost more than 96% of our monarchs. And this is one of the reasons why. The interesting thing is mosquito fogging does not control mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. Actually, it costs a lot of money. It doesn't control mosquitoes because you don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You've got to kill 90% of them to control them in the adult stage. Mosquito foggers kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to being effective. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And you can do it with biological control using mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, let it ferment in the sun for a few days. In other words, you're going to build up the population of diatoms and algae in your bucket. And that becomes an irresistible brew to ovipositing mosquitoes. The females will only lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So the eggs hatch, you throw in a mosquito dunk, the larvae eat it, and they die. Very targeted. If a dragonfly larva gets in here, it doesn't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, it doesn't hurt it. You might put a coarse screen over it so your local ground squirrel doesn't jump in. But it's targeted, it's cheap, and it's effective, particularly if everybody does it. We also have to recognize that it's not just big properties that are important in conservation. Small properties will play a crucial role as well. Remember, small properties, a small property is attached to another small property, is attached to another one. So we all have to think about the plants on those properties. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. She's got 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size. She's on a little island. She's not connected to any natural area at all. It also demonstrates how beautiful a native plant landscape can be. But she has recorded 125 species of birds using her property. So it works on smaller properties. And if you have no property at all, but just a balcony or a porch, you can use container gardening, which can supply a lot of resources for pollinators and those migrating monarchs. So everybody can get to play this conservation game. And they also can be beautiful. Now, fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against climate change and the biodiversity crisis. The two major crises on the planet have a single solution, and that is that conservation works. And I'm going to give you just a few examples of how well it works. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois. It's 3,800 acres. There are now more than 730 native plant species there. 180 species of birds have been recorded there. It used to be a cornfield. Nature is resilient. It will come back if we help it. This is my house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. I should say our house. My wife, Cindy, lives here as well. We have 10 acres. It was part of a farm that was broken up back in the year 2000. It had been mowed for hay. When you mow hay in Southeast Pennsylvania, where we live, you're really mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive plants from Asia that are here. Multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and calorie pear and barberry, all those things. So when you stop mowing, that's what you get. When we moved in, we had 10 acres of Asian vines and plants and just about nothing else there. So step one is to get rid of that stuff. And I know it's a lot of work. You know, it's not that hard when you get your wife to do it, which is what I did. And you know what? It's 10 acres. Little old Cindy got rid of most of the plants on our 10 acres. I helped a little bit, but once they were gone, we could put the plants back. And that's the key. You got to put the native plants back and you can get effective conservation. I have been counting the number of moths that are now making a living on our property because of the plants that we put back. And I am up to 1,256 species of moths that I have taken pictures of because we put the plants back. And we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania's 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have recorded 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And some of them are really, really pretty things, like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer. They all got great names. The neighbor, the little devil, the horrid zally, the forgotten frigid owlet. What a great name. The visitation moth. When you are visited by the visitation moth, it is a good day. The obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, there is an implicit arches as well. The snowy-shouldered aclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink-shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotus, the showy emerald, the green marvel, the Harris's three-spot, the old wife underwing, the eyed pectes, the tufted bird-dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird-dropping moth? The hog sphinx. This is the spun glass caterpillar, one of the most fantastic results of natural selection in nature. And hundreds of other species of caterpillars have come to the plants on our property. And that leads people to ask, well, gee, if you've got all these caterpillars on your property, they're going to eat all the plants. You'll have no plants at all. Well, that's not true. And why not? It's not true because we've got the things that eat those caterpillars. We've got birds, a lot of birds. We've got 62 species of birds that have bred on our property, and they rear their young on thousands of caterpillars per nest. So that helps control them. We've also got lots of caterpillar predators, things like ambush bugs and assassin bugs and predatory stink bugs. This guy sat next to this aggregation of milkweed tussock moths and ate one a day. He probably ate more than that. And there were a lot fewer by the time he got through. Then we have hymenopteran parasitoids, the wasps that most of them are laying eggs in caterpillars and killing them. This is a Pandora Sphinx caterpillar, which is essentially dead. It was the host to all of these Panelese braconid wasps. The larvae eat out the insides of this guy, then they tunnel through his exoskeleton, spin a cocoon, and then emerge as adults. So this single caterpillar has produced, I don't know what, 25 native natural enemies that are going to go eat other caterpillars. Then we have predatory wasps themselves. What they do is they sting the caterpillar and paralyze it, and then carry it off to their nest, and then lay an egg on it. So this guy's not dead. And this is nature's refrigeration system. If they stung it and killed it, it would rot before the egg even hatched. But when it's paralyzed, it doesn't die, and then the egg hatches and eats the caterpillar alive. And we have a lot of vertebrates that are eating insects as well. Things like our skunks and possums and raccoons and foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. And we have tree spring peepers and other frogs. We've got toads. We've got salamanders. We've got ringneck snakes. All these guys are eating insects, and the cutest little gray tree frogs, which actually are green when they're young, all eating insects on our property. That's why our plants are not defoliated. But lawn our lawn goals are too modest. We do want to reduce the area of lawn, but there's a lot of land out there that is not lawn. Most of our privately owned land is in small woodlots, cropland, or rangeland. I'm not going to talk about woodlots because you don't have a lot of those in the Rio Grande Valley, but we've got 406 million acres of woodlots that are managed by private citizens, not logging companies in the U.S., and how they are managed is going to make a huge statement about biodiversity. What about cropland? Well, there is a lot of cropland in Texas. As a matter of fact, we got 410 million acres of cropland in the U.S., and that's all these light green areas here. And there's several things we can do in cropland to improve biodiversity without reducing yield, without reducing the area that's in cropland. We can manage the roadsides properly. We can put back the hedgerows. We can add prairie strips, and we can limit our use of neonicotinoid insecticides. The monarch butterfly has largely disappeared because we have removed the forage and the milkweed plants that it needs that were on the sides of agricultural fields. We've removed them and planted grass. And that's because of Roundup Ready corn and soybeans. We could spray the crop and then spray right up to the road and then plant grass. So not only did we remove milkweeds and asters and goldenrod and all the things that the monarch need, we also then added something that had to be mowed on a regular basis, adding carbon to the atmosphere. But we can replace that, and people are doing that. Iowa is leading the way in terms of acreage converted to natural prairie systems. So we made a huge mistake there. We can fix it. We can also put the hedgerows back. We removed hedgerows because they got in the way of big machinery, but there's a lot of areas we can put them back that doesn't hurt the big machinery. And if we make sure they are comprised of native plants, we can save a lot of biodiversity. When we allow them to be built with non-native plants, diversity crashes. We did a little study in just with an undergrad. We went out and counted caterpillar. We measured caterpillar populations in hedgerows that were invaded by non-natives. This is autumn olive and multiflora rose and many of the other things in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and compared the caterpillar populations in those invaded hedgerows to populations in hedgerows that were not invaded. And this is what we found. A 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars. In other words, the amount of energy that's in that woodlot for those birds to eat. 96% reduction in bird food. So that's why we want to keep those woodlots or those hedgerows filled with native plants and not the invasives that don't support the caterpillars. Adding prairie strips to our ag fields. What a wonderful idea. This is right in the middle of the corn and soybean fields, and you add them at right angles to the direction of water flow off of the ag field. When you do that, not only do you support pollinators, but you also reduce topsoil loss by 95%, reduce water pollution by 90%. It's supported by USDA CREP programs. It seems like a no-brainer. Every single field out there should have a very thick prairie strip through it. And then finally, we've got to minimize our use of neonicotinoids, particularly as seed coatings. When they're seed coatings, it's not even counted as an insecticide. They are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. And they're used preventively. So whether or not you have an insect problem, you're using neonicotinoids. Only 5% of the product is taken up by the plants. The other 95% washes off into the watershed where it's very persistent, or it blows away on dust where we have no idea what havoc it's wreaking. And the interesting thing is, doesn't increase yield. If you compare yield in a field where they use neonics and a field where they don't, there's no increase in yield. So we're doing all of this for nothing. Okay, rangeland. Important land use in Texas. 770 million acres of rangeland, 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. But it doesn't have to be an ecological disaster. We just have to manage it properly. And that means not overgrazing it. It means put the beavers back, believe it or not, and keep the cows out of the streams. What do I mean by put the beavers back? If you look at the havoc that ranching has caused, particularly in the Southwest, it's always blamed on overgrazing, but it really was the elimination of the beaver that allowed the land to be degraded. Because when beavers are eliminated, the streams become in-cut and it lowers the water table. It dries out all the land around it, desertifies it, which makes it really vulnerable to overgrazing. But when you put the beavers back, it raises the water table. They build dams, of course. They build wetlands, very valuable places, and they become thriving ecosystems once again. But you have to keep the cows out of the streams, fence them out, because they will eat the woody vegetation. They'll eat the willows. They'll eat the cottonwoods, and they trample the stream banks. And of course, this is where most of the life on these grazing lands is. So there's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches, and that is they depend, whether or not they succeed depends on the decisions that you and I make. These are not scientific issues, they're sociological issues. I had a student a couple of years ago who on a final exam wrote, "While conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, what we're really managing is people." And that is so true. These are people problems. We're talking about changing the culture from an adversarial relationship to nature to a collaborative one. And it's the only way forward, folks. And people wonder, well, can we do this? Of course we can do this. Of course we can do this. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. People all over the world are saying, well, gee, the Earth's falling apart, but what can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can add a pollinator garden, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can remove invasive plants, one person can use keystone plants. If you're a rancher, you can keep the cows out of the streams. You can put in the beaver dams. They call them I forget what they call them, but the beavers aren't there, but you put the dams back yourself. Analogs, beaver dam analogs, and it restores the ecosystem to the point where the beavers can come back. Lots of things that we can do to increase biodiversity on our private properties. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. That's too easy to get depressed doing that. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Be a volunteer. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So we hope Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation and the guidance for millions of people to tackle these conservation challenges, to build those biological corridors that connect those habitat fragments and put real habitat back in between those fragments. And whether or not we do that now is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. And good luck to all of you.
Thank you, Doug. That was awesome. A lot of really valuable information packed into that presentation. So I think people will absolutely enjoy that and walk away feeling empowered and armed with some knowledge on things that they can do. We did have some some questions that the community asked, if you don't mind, if you have a little bit of time for a
I
few
do, yeah,
questions here.
that would be fine.
One of them was, do you have any advice for people who want to change ordinances in their cities to encourage more native landscaping? And if there's any examples that you would like to draw people's attention to?
There's a group called Wild Ones. I don't know if there's any chapters in Texas or not. It's more of an upper Midwest group, but there are a number of chapters now, and they have put several different ordinances on their website, free for people to go to and use examples of all different kinds of ordinances from encouraging native plants and reducing lawn and all of the things that we just talked about. So go to Wild Ones national website and download those ordinances. That's a good place to start.
Awesome. Thank you. What is one of the most frequent, since you're traveling around the country and you're hearing from people wanting to do these sorts of bring back the native plants, what's one of the more frequent yet avoidable issues you've seen when people are trying to do this sort of urban restoration?
We have this idea in our culture that if you use native plants, it's going to reduce property value. We got the idea that they're wild and messy. But any landscape, no matter whether the plants are native or not, can be wild and messy if you let it be wild and messy. And this is why I don't say get rid of lawn. I say minimize the use, but use it as a cue for care. I don't know if the people can see the picture right behind you, but that lawn is used perfectly as a cue for care. It's the place where you walk. It can guide you through your landscape. As Thomas Rayner says, lawn should not be wall-to-wall carpeting. It should be an area rug. But you mow it, you maintain it, and that is the cue that says to your neighbors, I get what the culture is, and I want my yard to be pretty too. I'm not going to lower property values. So the biggest stumbling block is misguided attitudes about what native landscaping is. We're simply putting more plants into our landscape, but we're not abandoning landscaping altogether. We're taking care of it. Lawn lining the beds or your driveway or your sidewalk is one of the best way to do that.
Awesome. Thank you. And then last one here would be, what would you say to people who think that they have a brown thumb and just whatever they're going to put in is going to die and just feel very discouraged that they're capable of growing these plants in their spaces?
Right. Well, the reality is most people do actually have a brown thumb. Most people don't garden themselves. They hire somebody. They hire a lawn service. We're busy these days. We're doing our phones. We're doing all the digital stuff. But there are a lot of people. There's a giant horticulture industry. There's the lawn care industry. We just need to retrain them so that you can hire an ecological landscaper to pick the plants, make it pretty, maintain it, but it will be, you will increase the ecological integrity of our yard. So it's a matter of picking up the phone and hiring somebody, as most people do today. So you don't have to develop a green thumb. If you want to, it's a lot of fun and that's great, but it's not a necessity. This does not have to be something that you take on when you don't have time to do it. But that's an industry we have to build. There are not enough ecological landscapers out there right now. So if you're looking for a career, that will be a productive one because everybody wants it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Tallamy. As always, it's enlightening and I feel ready to get back out there and plant more native plants. So thank you. And we will go ahead and stop the recording here.
All right.